All right, thank you all for being here. Part 2 of our Blame It on the Brain seminar, emphasizing the question mark. All right, so thank you all for being here. We'll go ahead and start with a word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Father, we thank you for this time that we have set aside as the body of your Son, Jesus, to learn more about who you are and what you say about things that affect us, affect our life, and things that we need to wrestle with, things that we need to make sure that we understand what your word says about it, that we can confirm and agree that your word stands as the authority over these things, over the created world, over which you reign supreme and sovereign. So help us, Lord, to think that way. Help us to understand what we discussed tonight. And above all, help it to lead us in worship to you, to think right and great thoughts about who you are and what you have done. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are going to pick up with where we left off last time with, I think, just a smidge of overlap from last week, but it'll be good for us to review. So duality, pop quiz. What am I talking about when I say applications of our duality? Say it louder.
We're body and spirit. We're physical and spiritual.
Body and spirit, physical and spiritual. And Emily wasn't even here last week, so that's good. So when we say applications of our duality, we mean, what does it matter? We spent an hour last week creating and establishing the argument that we are two parts, at least. That we are both a physical part, which for the purpose of this seminar we're referring to as our brain, and we are a spiritual, we are a soul. The Bible refers to it a number of ways. The soul, the spirit, the inner man. Peter refers to it as the inner person of the heart, right? And so at the very least, we have a distinction between two different components of what it means to be a whole person, right? And in God's created order, a whole person is both the physical part of him or her and the immaterial. So as we look to apply that, we want to remember three principles. One, the brain cannot make us sin. The brain does affect the heart, but vice versa, the heart does affect the brain. As we look at these in a little more detail, the brain cannot make us sin. What we're not saying is that the brain is not responsible or doesn't contribute or doesn't influence how our life goes. We recognize that the brain can make life very difficult, but the brain does not cause or force us to engage in sinful behavior. So when we're looking at the question of, am I responsible? Is my life this way because of the way I was wired? Do I do these things? Do I think? Do I act this way because of my brain? Something that I have no control over, something that is enacted upon me. We have to remember this principle, right? The brain cannot make us sin. The brain can for sure make life very difficult, but the brain does not cause us to or force us to engage in sinful behavior. And this is a hope-producing principle because what it means essentially, we are not at the mercy of our bodies. Our life is not determined according to the way we were wired, right? And we brought up last time the fact that there are some ways that we are wired that we're thankful do not determine our fate, right? We are not, maybe some of you are, but for the most of us, I would dare say we're not wired to be compassionate. We're not wired to be forgiving. We are not wired to be patient, right? And so if what we're talking about when it comes to brain science is this is just who I am because of the way I was wired, we are really neglecting the call to be different, to be transformed, to be renewed, right? To be like Christ is to be those very things that we're not necessarily wired to be like. And it's a good thing. And so that's why I say it's a hope-producing principle, that we are not at the mercy of our bodies. What I wanted to say, I'm sorry. This seminar is based off of the book Blame It on the Brain, written by author, counselor. His name is Ed Welch. He's a faculty member at CCEF, and that is the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation. But Ed Welch is a clinical psychologist. He got his PhD from the University of Utah in neuropsychology and counseling, right? And so sometimes we might be inclined to believe, well, anyone who's talking to us about this stuff from a biblical perspective probably is uninformed, or at the very least unaware of what's out there, right? But Ed Welch is a very diligent student of the brain science. He is currently a credentialed and licensed psychologist, yet a biblical counselor, right? So this is someone who, for us, praise the Lord, is wrestling with these things, right? Because like I said last week, we're not all together necessarily reading peer-reviewed scholarly articles on brain surveys and brain research findings. Thankfully, we have biblically faithful people who can understand it and who are wrestling with those things for us. And at least for my sake, boiling it down to a point where it's understandable. So, and we are actually out of copies in the Book Nook. I think it's called the Book Nook. But we have more in order. We have more in order. So they should be here sometime this week if you guys want to read this for yourselves. Principle number 2, the brain affects the heart, right? And so when we talk about the brain cannot make us sin and how that's a hope-producing principle, I think about my own life, right? If the way I was wired before predetermined the type of life I was supposed to live, or the trajectory that my life was supposed to go through, then that's misery. That's tough. That is just accepting defeat. That is a defeatist attitude. But thankfully, because the brain cannot make us sin, then I don't have to assume or just base my life off of the fact this is who I am, this is how I was wired, and unfortunately, that's my lot in life. And for some of you who don't know, that includes suicidal ideation, depression, addiction, right? And so thankfully, I don't have to accept that, let's see, 2008, right? I've been clean since 2008. So, but there are some principles, there are some approaches, even to addiction, that would say in 2025, I need to wake up and I need to remind myself, you have to battle the way you are wired every single day, right? You have to battle. There's one of the premier pieces of literature from Alcoholics Anonymous is called Just for Today. And it's a daily, for all intents and purposes, a devotion that they send out. And the premise behind it is just for today. Stay sober today. Make good choices today. Right? And thankfully, I don't have to, 17 years later, wake up with a primary function that I don't use hard drugs today. Right? Thankfully, I am being transformed, and my mind itself, my brain itself, is being changed and rewired in a way that is not my primary function throughout the day. Right? Is to, just for today, not use hard drugs, right? And so we're thankful for that because the brain cannot make us sin, and the brain affects the heart. And we can see this very clearly for any of you who have children or have had children, right? The lack of self-control and restraint that children show when their bodies or their brains are affected in even the slightest way is astounding, right? Hungry or tired children can behave in ways that are almost unrecognizable, right? We can look at them and be like, who are you, right? What is this? You're not my child at this point. But when they get a good rest or they have a snack and they have a good meal and they come to you and they seem like totally different children, you're like, who are you? What happened to the kid that was there 30 minutes ago, right? In a very simple way, what we're experiencing and acknowledging is that the brain does affect the heart. And we have to be honest. The brain requires certain things. It requires food, it requires air, it requires blood, it requires water, right? It requires rest. So when any of those things are in lack, it can affect us. Now, that doesn't necessarily excuse it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it causes our sin. But in a very even childish way, we can acknowledge and accept the fact that, yeah, our brains do affect how we act, how we respond, how we think. Even for adults, hangry, right? You guys have heard the term hangry, right? What we're saying is my brain is affecting, my body is affecting the way I'm in my soul, in my immaterial part, responding to you. And we don't necessarily excuse it. We don't say, do whatever you want, act however you want. I understand you're hungry. What do we say? I don't care if you're hungry. You can't act like that. You can't talk like that. You can't respond like that. But what we're recognizing at a very core principle is that the brain does affect the heart. The brain indeed has had its effects, but instead of creating anger or lust, it exposes tendencies that were already in the hearts. Only they were able to hide them as long as their brains were working well, right? And so this is a much more direct quote, but how we explained it was when we're hungry, when we're tired, when we feel irritated, what we're understanding or experiencing is when everything's going well, when our brains are functioning and have what they need for proper functioning, then it's a lot easier to behave rightly, right? But when we behave inappropriately, we can't say that my brain made me do it. What we're saying is when my brain functions properly, I can hide these things a little bit better. I have a little bit more of a filter, right? Has anyone ever heard of alcohol referred to or explained as liquid courage? Has anyone heard that, right? I like to drink in social settings because it makes me a little bit more friendly and amicable and outgoing. What is that essentially saying? It's saying when my brain doesn't work at the level it usually does, I can act differently, right? And so that's what alcohol does, and some people would say that's a positive experience. Like liquid courage is not necessarily, in that person's mind, a negative thing, but ultimately what they're saying is I have certain filters and boundaries and behaviors that I do not engage in, but using alcohol lowers those filters, reduces those boundaries, and allows me to engage in behaviors that I typically wouldn't, right? And so that's what this quote is from Ed Welch in the book, that the brain isn't creating anger. The brain isn't creating lust that previously wasn't there before. It's saying potentially that the person was better at hiding it when their brain functioned properly. And any type of brain disorder potentially decreases their ability to hold up those filters or those boundaries. Okay? Any thoughts?
Chris, just for clarification.
Yes.
You're differentiating between the heart and the mind, correct?
Heart and the brain. Heart and mind would both be, at least for these purposes, yes. Yeah.
In other words, the mind, we're associating more with the heart.
Yes.
And the brain is the physical part.
The physical part.
The mind is the immaterial.
Right. And when we say the brain affects the heart, we understand that the actual feeling that you feel is a result of chemicals, right? We don't dispute the existence and the influence of dopamine or norepinephrine, right? We understand what they are and how they make us feel and how they act. So we're not saying neurotransmitters don't exist because we're Christians and we don't believe that, right? What we're saying is we understand these things exist. We understand that the way we feel is often the result of these neurotransmitters, but at the same time, they do not determine who we are and how we respond. So when we say the brain doesn't make us sin, but the brain does affect the heart, this is essentially what we're talking about. Adam.
Tell me would this analogy work? If someone who has gone without can't rely on their next meal. That's just their way of existence. It could affect their heart and mind in such a way that they are hopeless. They have a sense of hopelessness, and that affects, maybe it goes back the other way, it affects the way that they think and behave as well, the way that their brain responds to certain situations. Does it kind of go both ways like that?
Sure, yes, it does, and the heart affects the brain, both ways. And we don't just mean that our heart can go against what our brain says. Remember last week we talked about our wedding vows. And when we say traditional wedding vows that in sickness or in health, for better or for worse, what we're saying is at times our situations, our circumstances are going to warrant potentially some expression, some response, some feeling from the heart. But what I'm promising to you is that I will be in disagreement with my body, right? When my body says, this is stressful, you need to react a certain way, I promise to you that I'm going to disagree. I'm going to be loving. I'm going to be kind. I'm going to be patient and understanding. I think a lot of marriages will be better served if we understood what we meant when we said vows, right? But I think it's become just more traditionalism than just, here's an actual promise that I'm making to you, that we're making to each other. So when we say the heart affects the brain, essentially, in a scientific term, we're talking about neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity, the idea here is the brain can change physically, right? The pathways that thoughts and reasoning and logic go through, the emotions that some chemicals produce can actually be changed, right? And this is the point for most counseling, both clinical mental health and biblical counseling, right? Changing your mind is just not the ability to make different decisions or respond in a different way, right? There's actually something physiological going on, right? And so neuroplasticity, all right, I was about to get ahead of myself. Neuroplasticity is the reality that our brain can go through and use different pathways. One analogy I heard that I think helps explain it is, you know, when you guys type in a Google search, right? And the first time you're searching something, you have to type it in, maybe the full phrase or the full question that you're looking to the answer for. But after you've researched that question, after you've searched that or typed that in Google enough, what happens? You get to type one or two letters, and what happens? The rest of your question pops up, right? It assumes that this is what you're doing or this is what you're looking for. That's kind of the pathways, especially the reward pathways in our mind, is here we don't have to spend a lot of time and energy and effort to figure this thing out. We have a problem and we have a solution. The brain's main goal is efficiency. So when the brain says, here's the problem, and you've said, here's how we're going to solve it, whether it's drugs, whether it's escapism, whether it's pornography, whatever it is, right? Whenever you've been presented with a problem and you've told your brain, this is how we'll solve it, then the brain, like a Google search, says, all right, well, next time, you don't even have to type the whole question in. We can just assume this is the path we're going, right? And that's neuroplasticity. Those are neural pathways. And so, but those actually change, right? We are not created with those things. When we decide, I'm really, really anxious about this situation, or life really, really hurts, so I need to escape for just a minute, just 5 minutes, just 30 minutes. And if the problem is life hurts and the solution is I need to escape, I need to feel better, and once those two things are linked together, they create that pathway. So the next time you feel life really hurts, life is really uncomfortable, I really don't like the way life is going, you don't have to type in the rest of the question. Your brain says, all right, we've seen this problem before. we actually have a solution that works. We have a solution that solves the problem, right? And so the brain isn't like, but let's consider some other options, or let's think about maybe some different potentialities or different opportunities. The brain says, we already know what works. Let's just do that, right? And so neuroplasticity is the reality that doesn't have to be the case for the rest of time. Just because your brain has attached this solution to this problem does not mean that forever that's how your brain is going to work. Okay? Whew, we got in there for a minute. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, Ella. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And think, take a step back for a moment and think about our initial premise, the brain made me do it, right? This neuroplasticity, just the idea, just the reality of neuroplasticity really flies in the face of the brain made me do it, because we can respond with, but it doesn't have to be that way. That is not guaranteed. That is not inevitable. That is not your fate. That can change, right? And it can be difficult and challenging. It can feel like something is actually wrong with you. But the reality is the brain can change. And the heart affects that. When you think about anxiety, right? What is anxiety? Anxiety is your body responding to something that you have determined is dangerous, risky, fearful, threatening to something you love or value, right? Now that's a clear, direct connection. Sometimes it doesn't feel clear and direct, right? Sometimes you're walking through the grocery store or you're sitting at home on your couch and all of a sudden anxiety creeps up, right? And we can't necessarily say, oh, well, here's the connection. Here's what value I have that is being threatened or offended or violated. Sometimes we're sit there wondering, what is going on? What happened? Everything seems to be fine. I feel fairly comfortable. There's nothing risky or dangerous or threatening going on here, yet my body is responding a certain way. All right, and so, but commonly, universally really, the response to that as far as counseling goes is, one, what matters most to you? What values, what beliefs, what in those moments is being threatened, is being violated, is being intimidated, or at the very least is being ignored, right? Because the body and stress and anxiety and worry and care is the way God designed us, so that our body agrees with our heart. Like, hey, you have to care about this. You have to pay attention to this. You can't just let this fly under the radar. It is a good thing. It is a good system that God created us with, so that our bodies literally make it more difficult for us to ignore the things that we've determined are good, right? Any of you who have ever completed basically any achievement, right? Whether it's school, whether it's professional, whether it's ministerial, right? Something that maybe had a deadline coming and you felt stressed about, right? And you couldn't sleep and it was occupying your mind. Now that can go to an unhealthy level, but at its core, it's your body saying, hey, you have to think about this. I'm going to remind you in an uncomfortable way that this matters, right? So those people who don't care about anything, those people who never get stressed out, those people who aren't concerned with deadlines and things like that, that's not altogether a good thing either, right? Because God designed that our body would say, hey, this matters, right? You have to pay attention to this. You can't ignore this. Whether it's a Sunday night seminar, whether it's a counseling session, whether it's a deadline at work, and you feel stressed out about it. We have come to a point in society where anything uncomfortable belongs in the bad category, right? So if it's uncomfortable, if we don't like it, If it makes us feel awkward, then we say, well, this isn't bad, or this is bad, and if it's bad, we need a solution to it. I would propose to you that God is saying the way God created you and wired you is, look, I'm going to add some emphasis to the things that matter, right? And I'm going to allow you and you allow your body to agree with your mind at times. Unfortunately, that system is broken. That system is flawed. That system is fallen. And so at times, we're like, okay, what matters right now? What's being threatened or offended or violated? And we can't draw that clear connection. But that's the perversion of the good way that God created us, right? It is a good thing that our bodies agree at times with the fact that things matter to us, that things are important, that we value things, okay? Any discussion, thoughts? Anyone besides Adam? Yeah, Adam.
I just wanted to comment that when we're talking about the brain, we're talking about it here as a single unit, where there's a lot of different active parts of the brain.
Sure.
And the more cognitive, deeper functioning parts like the neocortex and prefrontal cortex, those are what can be redirected with neuroplasticity. But when your limbic system, which helps you regulate emotions, are being hijacked, your prefrontal cortex can't kick in when a limbic system is out of control. And so that, I think, gives to our kids, like when they're hungry, they'll start crying and not know why they're crying, but they can't get themselves together because they can't have the cognitive function at a higher level because a different part of their brain is out of control.
Sure. Yeah.
And so when you think about it that way, it makes you wonder, the brain's complicitness.
Yeah. And our moral culpability in it, right? But as we disciple our children, we consider, are we going to, in those moments, say, you're hungry, right? You're tired. You skipped your nap today, right? And so and essentially, when we offer that excuse, what we're saying is, you are beholden to your brain. And what your brain tells you you need and how your brain tells you to respond and the emotions that your brain tells you to feel is supreme, right? Or do we say, as we disciple our children, hey, I understand that you're feeling this way. I understand that a reality right now is that you haven't eaten in 6 hours and you haven't slept since you woke up this morning. And you need a nap and you need lunch. But, right, we are not going to allow that to be the determining factor in how we respond and how we act and how we love or care or show patience or obey,
I think for me, a blind spot as a parent is emotion isn't sin, emotion's natural. And so treading the line where a kid expressing emotion is a very natural thing, and how they respond to that can go into sin.
Sure.
But me not jumping to the gun where, why are they crying? Why is she,
Yeah.
It's just food, it's just,
Yeah.
And then one other comment is about the anxiety responses. And the other thing that we didn't mention is that sometimes it's physiological. And a deficit of serotonin can throw someone into a more anxious state that when corrected makes that person have a much more manageable process with that.
And the only thing I would say to that is when you say much more manageable, I think it's right to say easier to manage, but not unmanageable, right? Right, like someone's serotonin levels, someone's sympathetic nervous system ramping up, right? Obviously, they're physiological, right? It is not a sin that your blood pressure is rising. It's not a sin that your heartbeat is racing. It's not a sin that you start to sweat. Those things are the result of your sympathetic nervous system. But as we are helping those who may be suffering and challenged with those things, right, I think our goal is to say, what what matters most to you? What is your heart telling you? There is nothing more important in this moment than this thing, right? And that goes back to the Puritans. The Puritans were talking along these lines about psychology even hundreds of years ago, right? We cannot affect the way the brain responds. We can't. That's not up to us. It's not a voluntary function. What we can affect, what I think God calls us to affect, or what God means when he says we are being transformed, is what types of things does your body respond to? You know what I mean? Like, are these the types of things that should matter in your heart and you value to a degree that triggers this sympathetic nervous response? Right? And I think that while we can't tell our brain, stop responding this way, we can't tell our body, lower your blood pressure, right? But we can question, hey, why did this situation, why did this thing trigger such a response? Is it something that I care too much about? Is it something that I value above what I should be valuing, right? And I think instead of changing our body's response, I change what our body responds to. And I think that's more of a ethical, appropriate response, especially in biblical counseling, right? When we discuss worship and idolatry, right? We're saying maybe we care too much about something. And I think that's what emotions are. Emotions at our core are the way we get to see our heart. We don't get to look inside our heart, yet we're called to evaluate it, right? And so God, in his goodness and his wisdom, said, I'm going to call you to evaluate your heart, and I'm going to give you a clear picture of what is in your heart. And his clearest, most accurate picture that he gives to us of what is in our heart is our emotions, right? And so happiness, sadness, depression, grief, excitement, joy, jealousy, whatever it is, irritability, frustration, anger, whatever it is, we can at the very least say, this is a demonstration, this is evidence of what matters most to me. This is evidence of what I care about the most, right? And so in that way, we cannot categorize emotions good and emotions bad, right? Happiness, joy, excitement, good. Anger, impatience, irritability, bad. Because what if I'm super happy and you say, wow, Chris, you're really on cloud nine this morning. What's going on? I've never seen you this happy before. I'm like, yeah, I am working with like 10 couples, and all of them are in the middle of a nasty divorce. And it is just good stuff. You would be like, I would like to talk to Rich just for a minute, please, right? But you're not going to say, well, you're happy. At least you're happy, right? When we look at people who are on trial, what's one of the most common things that are brought to mind? Remorse or no remorse? They show remorse or they don't show remorse. That's not because we think that physically and externally they should show us some negative experience. What we're saying is, I'm concerned that they don't show remorse, and what I mean is they apparently don't value human life or other people or the law, right? So even when we're talking about remorse, we're saying if they show remorse, then we are more inclined to think that there's hope for them, because at the very core, we're saying they care about something. Something good matters to them. And they feel like, because they're showing remorse, they feel like they've violated those good values. But if we don't see remorse, we're like, do you care about anything? Do you care about life? Do you care about children? Do you care about the law? Do you care about other people? Anyway, this is not an emotion seminar, but I can get going on emotions. I think they are severely misunderstood, and I think so much of even just humanity, but the church specifically, would be greatly helped if we understood what emotions actually are and how God intended them to be used and understood. So that's on you, Adam, because you got me off. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change. Scripture demonstrates a reality that some spiritual sickness or sin does indeed have physical consequences. Listen to the words of David in Psalm 38. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink and fester because of my foolishness. I am utterly bowed down and prostrate. All the day I go about mourning, for my sides are filled with burning, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and crushed. I groan because of the tumult of my heart. Elsewhere, and after all this, talking about the wickedness of King Jehoram, the Lord struck him in his bowels with an incurable disease. So, what we're not saying is physical ailment, mental health disorders, any discomfort in life is 100% related to a specific volitional, sinful choice or behavior. But it is true. It is reality that people understood that some of the things that they've experienced physically are directly results of their ignoring God and ignoring his commands and willfully, volitionally choosing to disobey him and his goodness, his characters, and his purpose, right? And so what we say, though, is the only time you have reason to suspect a connection between sin and sickness is when repentance and faith are followed by physical healing. Even then, however, there may be other reasons for the alleviation of some such symptoms. So these three principles, the brain cannot make a sin, the brain affects the heart, and the heart affects the brain, will provide a biblical framework that we will apply to some specific disorders. All right. The brain did it. So if you remember, in the book, there's three main differentiations. The brain did it, maybe the brain did it, and the brain didn't do it, right? And so with the brain did it, what we understand is when we are seeing behavioral changes, when we are seeing even personality changes, we can clearly, even scientifically, point to data, point to brain imaging that says, yeah, this is at the very least influential or contributes to the way this person is acting. And so those of you who have cared for people who have dementia, Alzheimer's, or have suffered a traumatic brain injury, you can see, and you have certainly experienced yourself, yeah, this is definitely a consequence or an effect of the fact that they have dementia, Alzheimer's, or their brain has been terribly injured. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. What I want to do is just provide a helpful guideline for caring for someone, get information about either the disease or the injury, about the changes that the person is experiencing, get understanding. Don't assume you know. Don't assume you've read 5 books about Alzheimer's so you know what this person is going through. Get understanding, right? Care about this person and their specific experience and unique experience. Distinguish between spiritual and physical symptoms. Ask yourself and others, does this behavior violate God's commands? Is it a result of brain changes, or is it both? And oftentimes, at the very least, it's at least both, right? Spiritual symptoms, we speak to the heart with wisdom and love. We don't scold, we don't reprimand, we don't argue, right? We don't shame or guilt. But there are scores of cases of people who very clearly still have their mind intact, even when their brain is failing, right? There was one article published in, I think it was Times Magazine, right? And this guy was a clinical psychologist, and he was studying certain cases of Alzheimer's, and he said, the people who were caring for him, the medical team said, well, her mind is still intact. And he said to them, you think her mind is still intact? You think she still has a soul? You do not think that who she is physically is just completely wasting away? And their response of the medical team was, watch her in chapel. Go to chapel and watch her, right? And so he went to chapel, and he concluded, I don't know that she has Alzheimer's at all, right? And so that is not the principle to go by, but what is often at least worth exploring is that this person is still capable of being spoken to, of their heart and their mind being spoken to with biblical truth, right? There are cases of people who are in severe stages of dementia and Alzheimer's, and the only thing they can say is, Jesus loved you and Jesus died for you, right? So spiritual symptoms, like I said, we don't scold, we don't argue, we don't shame or guilt, but still, in our love for that person, we speak to those spiritual symptoms with compassion, with understanding, and patience. And then physical symptoms, we either maximize the remaining strengths and we correct or minimize the weaknesses. Introduction to psychiatric problems. So when we say psychiatric problems, we are putting them in a different category as opposed to brain disease or brain dysfunction. We are saying here are some situations like Alzheimer's, dementia, and traumatic brain injury where there's actual categorical, identifiable evidence that this is what is contributing to the way they think and the way they behave. Psychiatric problems, we're saying at the very least we're not quite there yet. We can't look. There's no blood test or brain scan to identify depression, generalized anxiety, post-traumatic stress, adjustment disorder, right? Major depressive disorder. We can't look at a picture of a brain and say, see, this is what we know. This is how we know this person suffers from this certain mood disorder or any other psychiatric problem. So they're different from medical diseases where you can see physical evidence of the problem. 3 reliable propositions. Psychiatric problems are always spiritual and sometimes physical, right? We'll get into that here in a second, so hold on. Psychiatric disorders tend to respond to medication, and psychiatric labels are descriptions, not explanations. Always spiritual and sometimes physical. Ed Welch says you will never find a psychiatric problem where biblical help, counsel directed to the heart, is unnecessary, right? So that is a safe proposition, that is a safe guiding principle that you will never experience or encounter a psychiatric problem where biblical counsel directed to the heart is unnecessary, where it's not worth exploring. People suffering from a psychiatric disorder can be counseled concerning both the cause of the suffering and the response to it, right? So the Bible may not say this is what depression is. The Bible may not say this is what general anxiety is. The Bible may not explain the science behind post-traumatic stress disorder. But what we know is that on the front end of it, maybe the cause, there can be some spiritual components worth addressing, and at the very least, response to it, right? I worked with someone literally for 2.5 years, right? And she was resistant to treatment. It's called treatment-resistant depression. She had been through a score of different prescriptions, different medications, electroshock therapy, ketamine. She was desperate. She had tried it all, right? And so my goal with her was not, how do we cure you from depression, right? My goal with providing her with care and compassion and speaking to her soul is, one, how do we understand suffering? What is God's purpose for suffering? And what is our call as Christians to respond to it, right? And so that's what I mean when we say that we can be counseled concerning either the cause or the response, how we respond to the suffering and the challenges of life, even the psychiatric problems of life. Some studies show, this is from the Harvard Review of Psychiatry, some studies show that patients with less endorsement of biogenetic beliefs about depression seem more likely to recover. This is interesting, right? This is from the Harvard Review of Psychology, and what they're saying is that as a result of our findings, what we conclude is that people who are less likely to believe that their depression has a hereditary or a biological cause are actually more likely to recover from the depression, right? And so we're talking about how the mind, if you go back to our principles, how the mind affects the brain, right? Even just this belief that depression is something that I can approach and something that I can explore and work through without having to agree or believe that this is something that is happening to my brain that I am being victimized by, actually shows in scientific studies that those people are more likely to recover from their depression. Psychiatric disorders do tend to respond to medication, right? We can say that, and we can say that as biblical, faithful, God-fearing, Bible-believing Christians. We can say that. We can say that psychiatric disorders do tend to respond to medication, right? To disagree with that would be to really blur the lines between God's creation and the way God created us and how God has graced us with the ability to pursue health, right, and a life well lived. And so, but the most we can reliably say is that psychiatric medication may minimize the symptoms, but we do not know why. In antidepressant medication studies, placebos are shown to be clinically as effective as medication with active ingredients. And so if you guys go out there and look this up yourselves, I just want to make the point, clinically effective versus statistically effective. So when we say statistic differences, we're saying that the numbers were not exactly the same. Clinically effective, we're saying even the differentiation in those numbers don't actually matter, right? So clinically is like, what does it actually look like? How does it actually result or is it brought to bear in a person's life? And so what this study is saying is that placebos, right, not something with no active psychotropic ingredient is as effective as an antidepressant like an SSRI or a tricyclic. Irving Kirsch from the Harvard Medical School says, we have found no significant differences between these treatments or within different types of psychotherapy. So psychotherapy is talk therapy, is different other theories of counseling. They also studied the results from depressed individuals and how they responded to acupuncture, right? And so what they're saying is, yes, antidepressant medication, a pill, does tend to decrease or minimize the symptoms of depression, but we're not going to tell you that according to the data that medication is what is most effective and should be pursued. Besides that, when there doesn't seem to be any difference in the treatment, then the choice should be based on the risk or the harm, and out of all of these treatments, antidepressant drugs are the riskiest and the most harmful. They have actually found that antidepressant medication, those who are medicated with antidepressant medication long-term, are actually more likely to experience suicidal ideation or attempt suicide, right? So take that for what it's worth. Was there a hand over here? Does the Bible prohibit the use of mental health medication? Can anyone here say, here's a verse, here's a principle, here's a chapter, here's a prophet, here's a book of the Bible that says we should not, and even is sinful, to use mental health medication? Does that rattle anyone? It doesn't seem like there's any opposed to that statement, right? That the Bible does not prohibit the use of mental health medication. Does that rattle anyone? You don't have to out yourself. You don't have to raise your hand, right? But maybe that's something worth thinking on. And so if the Bible does not say you shall not use medication or science or any combination of the both to address what's going on in your mind, then the question doesn't become, is it sinful or not? The question becomes, is it wise or not? Right? And so when we are dealing with any of these psychiatric problems, or you're dealing with anyone who out of your circle is suffering from these psychiatric problems or mental health disorders, our question is most often not going to be found in, does the Bible say this is right or wrong, right? But what we're going to be considering is, what is the wisdom that the Bible provides about what this specific person in this specific situation is going through? Okay?
Chris, so in the last section we established that the brain can change. So if it can change for the better, we have to assume it can change for the worse. So when would psychiatric things turn into more physiological negative changes to the brain? Does that kind of move the goalpost on what bucket these things fall in?
I don't think at any point we need to dismiss whether or not the brain contributes to that experience. Right? Like, I don't think we need to draw a line that says, okay, well, the brain runs its course up to this point and then the mind takes over or something like that, right? Like with depression, with anxiety, with PTSD, with schizophrenia, with adjustment disorder, right? Any type of mood or personality disorder, we do not need to actually draw a line between, or even answer the question, does the brain, the physiological part of me, does it contribute to what I'm experiencing? It's safe to always say yes. And I think that's okay. And I think that's just acknowledging, one, the way God made us, and two, the way fallenness of the world affects us, right? Because we can say the way God made us in these experiences are perversions of what God intended to be good, right? It is good that our body would react, that our body would provide things like motivation, right? We hear stories about superhuman strength and superhuman speed and, stories about before I even knew what I was doing, I was reacting, right? You see your child playing in the street and a car coming, right? Thankfully, we don't need to conjure up an emotion. Thankfully, we don't need to conjure up motivation. Thankfully, we don't need to find some way to be even superhuman or more than what we feel like we're capable of, right? That is God's good design for a life lived well. But because of the fall, it's perverted, right? And so all of these things, I don't think we need to wonder whether or not the brain contributes or has significant influence on these things. I think it's safe to say yes, it actually does. I mean, feeling happy, like it or not, is the result of a chemical in your brain. You know what I mean? Like we cannot feel the feeling of happiness without the accompanying neurotransmitter. And so, but it's okay to admit that. Even as Christians, it's okay to admit that because it goes too far when it's deterministic, right? Because I don't have this chemical, I cannot obey God. I cannot make choices according to wisdom. I cannot believe who God is and what he has promised, right? Because of the chemicals that are present or lacking in my system, right? And so I think, yes, it's a safe assumption. It's an okay assumption. It's an acknowledgement of the way God created us for his glory and for our good to say that the body and the mind, the brain and the mind, work together and reinforce each other's thoughts, commitments, devotions, loyalties, etc. Right? And these types of problems that we experience, that a lot of us experience, we're just experiencing the perversion of that which God created for our good and for his glory. And so we don't have to wonder if the brain plays a part of it. I think our question that we ethically as Christians need to be able to answer is, am I this way because of my brain? You know, I think I got a little off track from your question, but in some of that, did it respond to what you were asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what I was getting at is, if the brain changes negatively because of a psychiatric issue like PTSD, does PTSD ever move from a same bucket as dementia because the brain has changed negatively.
And I would say that's why it fits into, well, we haven't even gotten to yet. I'm just going to skip a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe the brain did it. Maybe the brain did it. Yeah, we're nowhere near finished. Sorry, guys. We're still going to finish at 7. Don't worry. I'm not keeping you to 7:30, but we're just not going to finish it. So, yes, Scott.
Just had a quick question. It might be something later, but what would be your opinion of more of this happening? I've been in the medical field, especially pediatrics, for
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah.
And I've seen an increase in depression medication on kids, ADHD medication on kids, more and more and more, which makes me depressed. But what would be your opinion of why we keep seeing more and more of that? Not only in kids, obviously, but also in adults as well. We have ECTs that you mentioned earlier about shock therapy that are consistent of people coming in to get those all the time. More and more than when I first started as well. So
Yeah.
what would be your opinion? Do you think why we're seeing this increase recently?
Yeah, I think there's a number of contributing factors to it. I think it's in a very simple, and try not to be inconsiderate, but in a very simple way, it's just more acceptable, right? If not only just acceptable, but it's also championed, you know, and here is why you are like that. And if we can chalk up any difficulty, any challenge, any suffering that we encounter or experience as created beings, if we can chalk that up to, this actually isn't a moral failing. This isn't a character defect. This isn't something that I'm choosing not to fight against, but this is just who I am and why I am that way. That's a much easier pill to swallow, right? And when we have science, at the very least, in a manipulative way, reinforcing that, then, I brought up in one of the seminars I did before, but 80% of ADHD medication and depression and anxiety, those prescriptions are prescribed by like family practitioners, primary health, right? Primary care physicians. People who, I'm not saying they're completely unaware or they're ignorant, but they are not licensed psychologists or psychologists, and they are not those in that field. And what they're saying is, you're uncomfortable, we actually have something that could help with that, right? And I think it is a super, super flawed ideology of what life is about, what life is worth. Even Friedrich Nietzsche himself said the only thing in life that produces anything worth value is suffering. And if you remember, Nietzsche was the one who is famous for saying, your God is dead. If your God exists, he's about as terrible of a God as one can imagine, right? Yet, unknowingly, he agrees with the gospel, right? That what produces life for the person is the challenge and the affliction and the suffering and the consequential endurance, right? The way we respond to it. But when, as a society, we shift from there's value here to we shouldn't have to experience discomfort. We shouldn't have to experience pain. We shouldn't have to experience anything uncomfortable. And science backs it up with, you're right, we have something for that, right? I mean, I think we're just seeing a major sociological shift in even just our view of suffering, right? But I think it's a little bit, I don't want to say silly, but I think it's disconnected from reality in the sense that anyone who's ever gone to the gym realizes that there is no gain, there is no profit in working out if you are not sore the next morning, right? If you go to the gym and you work out and you think that you just put in the best workout you've ever done in your life and you wake up in the next morning and you're not sore, you're not going to feel great. You're going to be disappointed, right? You're going to say, man, I thought I really pushed myself. I thought, right, the presence of that pain, at least for that person in that moment, is the reality that I'm growing, that I gained something valuable yesterday in my workout, right? And so we see it in even just the littlest ways throughout life, but when it comes to other sciences, especially the psychiatric sciences, discomfort, challenge, affliction, it's something to be remedied, and we shouldn't be thinking about it the same way that we think of really the rest of life. And so that's yet another seminar, but it's a good question. I mean, it's 7 o'clock. It's 7 o'clock. I gotta just stop. I'm sorry. We didn't get to any diagnoses. I was gonna talk about depression. Maybe the brain did it, right? What we mean by that is we do not need to wonder if the brain contributes to feelings or experience of depression. It's okay that we can acknowledge that. It's okay that there are chemicals in our brain that help us feel better, and the lack or potentially the deficiency of them may indeed cause an experience that sounds like or is categorized like depression. The other one we were going to go over was addiction, and that is the brain did not do it. That falls in the category of we actually, in the scientific community, made a switch from this is a moral thing, the brain didn't do it, to recently, in the last 15, 20 years, the brain did do it. The brain is the reason why you suffer or struggle with addiction. And as a biblical position, we would disagree with that. We would say the brain did not do that. And there's really no question about it. But I know that is about as abruptly as you can conclude a seminar, but that's where we're at 7:03. I appreciate your guys' patience, your engagement, your thinking through this with me, and hopefully we'll be able to engage the topic at a later date. Thank you. You guys are dismissed.